Welcome everyone, I'm Matthias Waschek and I'm the Jean and Miles McDonough Director of the Worcester Art Museum. This is our very special annual lecture, the Amelia and Robert H. Haley Memorial Lecture, which was endowed by Bill Haley, a former corporator of the Worcester Art Museum, who established this annual lecture concerning the world of art, so very broad. We can do almost everything that the museum represents. And he established this in 1989, and ever since we had every single year, we had a Haley lecture. So, and one of the family members wanted to come today, and unfortunately there was a contretemps, she couldn't, but with her thoughts she is with us. I hope you all had a chance to see the lecture's accompanying exhibition, Reflections on a Changing Japan, the Evolution of Shin Hanga, which is curated by Fiona Collins-Rosedal. She's our assistant curator of Asian art. And this project was generously supported by the Carpenter Foundation with additional support from the Fletcher Foundation and the Japan Foundation. This is the very first time that the Japan Foundation has actually supported a project of the Worcester Art Museum, and I hope it's the first of many times. So thank you, Fiona, for having given them the pretext to support us. I would also like to recognize the trustees that I'm seeing in the room. First and foremost, Anne-Marie Solier with her husband, Lindsay. Anne-Marie and her husband have lent to this exhibition 3 outstanding Shin Hanga wood prints. And as a friend said, how can you even think that this is woodcut, because it is so finely done. We also have with us Marybeth Leonard, who sits over there. Any other trustee that I am forgetting? No, but it's a strong showing nonetheless. So thank you for being here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Fiona, the Assistant Curator of Asian Art and Curator of the exhibition. Fiona she has a very interesting background. So she holds an MA in Japanese Studies from SOAS. I still have to say what it is. It is the School of Oriental and Asian Studies, which is a very distinguished subdivision of the University of London. The word Oriental is a bit problematic. Everybody knows it, and for that reason, it's normally just given with the acronym. And she has a BFA in History of Art and Studio Art from the Pratt Institute. Fiona has been with us for several years now and has definitely left her mark. She was the curator of the Floating Worlds. She contributed to another really interesting exhibition on the imperfect modernism, how Asia was looking at modernism and Asian countries positioning themselves towards what the mostly colonial countries or colonizing countries defined as modernism, which is really a fascinating subject. And I'm hoping for many more with this powerhouse of Asian curators that we have at the Worcester Art Museum. Fiona also helped in the rotation of the Asian galleries. You see these rotations in the Japanese gallery behind the big glass wall, and we had many surprising and fabulous artworks in that context. And so I'm really proud that the Worcester Art Museum is there to be a springboard for young talents. And if you don't stay in Worcester, which we all hope that you will, may you conquer the world. So Fiona, why don't you take it from here and introduce our panelists?
All right, thank you so much, Matthias. Before we dive into the lecture itself, I just like to provide some background on the project that inspired it. My exhibition, Reflections of a Changing Japan, The Evolution of Shin Hanga. As some of you may know, the Worcester Art Museum became the first public collection of Japanese prints in the United States in 1901, following a seminal gift of over 3,000 works, primarily ukiyo-e prints, from the Worcester-born businessman John Chandler Bancroft. While researching this collection for earlier exhibitions, such as The Floating World in 2022, I actually discovered that following the Bancroft donation, WAM became a hub for contemporary Japanese artists in the 20th century. The museum hosted exhibitions of Japanese watercolors as early as 1904 and 5, participated as a venue for traveling Japanese print shows in 1924 and 27, welcomed demonstrations by leading printmakers like Yoshida Toshi in 1953, and began collecting contemporary abstract prints as early as the 1960s. The current Shin Hanga exhibition commemorates the legacy of one of the earliest categories of modern Japanese prints collected and displayed by the museum, Shin Hanga, or literally new prints. And I'm so pleased to introduce our panelists today. So first we have Dr. Alice Sung, who is professor of Japanese art history and architecture at Boston University. A specialist in Meiji visual culture, her work examines Japan's engagement with the US and Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as the role of exhibitions, institutions, and imperial imagery in cross-cultural exchange. Her books include the Imperial Museums of Meiji Japan and Modern Kyoto, and she is currently researching the representation of Japanese art and culture at World's Fairs, recently focusing on one that took place at the St. Louis Art Museum in 1904. Dr. Kendall Brown is Professor Emeritus of Asian Art History at California State University, Long Beach, and a prominent voice in the study of Shin Hanga. His influential publications, including Shin Hanga, New Prints in Modern Japan, and Visions of Japan, Kawase Hisui's masterpieces, have shaped scholarly and public understandings of 20th century Japanese prints. He has curated major exhibitions across the US, most recently, Songs for Modern Japan, Popular Music and Graphic Design, 1900 to 1950, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So drawing from both of their expertise, this panel will build upon the themes introduced in the exhibition, exploring how Shin Hanga were received and collected in New England, and how international relations shaped the movement's trajectory. It will consider the impact of US-Japan exchange, global art markets, and trans-Pacific travel on the production, circulation, and reception of these prints, while also highlighting the Worcester Art Museum's role in furthering awareness and scholarship of the movement. So before we delve into the prints themselves, I wanted to start off this panel by asking, what was the artistic and cultural landscape like in Japan when they first began to appear? And so we can start with Alice.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for coming on such a nice Sunday. And thank you. I wasn't asking for applause, but thank you. Just a show of hands, how many people know what the Meiji period is in Japan? Oh, good. It's a good. So I won't go into too many details, but very quickly, Meiji period in terms of time frame is from 1868 to 1912. So that's usually characterized as a time of really great transitions and transformations for Japan. It's political, it's cultural, it's economic, it's social. So we're here to talk about the art. And I wanted to start with this painting because it's usually not how one associates Japan. When you think about painting, you don't think oil on canvas, but this is exactly what it is. And it's nice to start that way because this is very much from the Meiji period Japan, but it is a product of a very new way of artistic training starting in the Meiji period, where the national government took part in actually educating students in art making. And so Asai Chu would be one of those artists who actually started his formal training in the Technical Fine Arts School that was organized by the Japanese government. It was in Tokyo. And that was when the government actually chose to consider what it would be like to westernize fine art training, so for painting, for sculpture, and some architectural design as well. And so the professors themselves were hired from Europe to do the training, and Asaichi was one of the few lucky ones who actually continued that education by traveling to Europe and going on site, learning from the people there, looking at the landscapes, as you can see here, and also learning from the professional artists there. So that is kind of a nice way to introduce what some of the most radical changes were, at least for the fine arts, the highest art forms during this time. But if we go to the next slide, I wanted to also share with you kind of how in other ways in this time period, it wasn't just the artistic education, but also the way art was being seen and exhibited. So this woodblock print, this triptych on the right here, is showing you a kind of a radical new way to publicly exhibit new kinds of art. You can see that you have artworks that are actually framed and hung on the wall, which most of you who already know a bit about Japanese art know that that's not the traditional way to look at Japanese art. You don't put it in a frame, you don't hang it on the wall. And so this is yet another way that the fine arts were impacted very immediately in the Meiji period, where there was kind of this public way of showing artworks and also kind of leading to different formats of artwork, including not just the traditional, ink on paper, ink on silk, scroll paintings, but actually oil on canvas, artworks in frames that can be exhibited basically kind of European style. And then just so we know, it's always important to showcase women artists. What was also radical with this very first National School of Art that was opened by the government was that women were actually allowed to be students in this technical fine art school. So this is them with the professor from Italy who was hired to teach them. So that was kind of a very rare example, because historically women were not, there weren't that many of them who could paint professionally, but that was one of the first things that was the new endeavor of the time.
I think the professor of sculpture even married his student and took her back to Italy.
Yes, back then that was still common for teachers to marry students, but yes, that was happening too.
And next.
Well, Alice has introduced us to this radical changes that take place in Meiji, late 19th century Japan, and often under the kind of auspices of what they called civilization and advancement, by which they meant Western civilization. In America, we have the opposite. It's the 19th century, it's the Gilded Age, and America is starting to perhaps broaden its own horizons away from just the Atlantic Ocean and European culture to across the Pacific and Asia and Japan in particular. So I wanted to look at this period in this sort of context, as Fiona asked us, from the opposite point of view, kind of Japan and the West. Often we use the term Japonisme, this sort of French idea, but let's call it Japanism, American interest. 40 years ago, a curator at the Wadsworth Atheneum over there in Hartford, not too far away, I'm from California, had an interesting catalog called The Japan Idea, and all what Japan meant for Americans in the late 19th century. And just with this slide, I want to talk about sort of high and low culture. So over at the MFA Boston, in the early 1890s, they hire Ernest Francisco Fenollosa, who had been one of these foreign specialists who had gone to Japan to teach at national universities. He comes back and becomes the first curator of Japanese art in America in Boston, organizes exhibitions on ukiyo-e prints, a great Hokusai exhibition in 1894 with catalog there. And this is the old MFA, Neo-Gothic building. And he's showing Hokusai, but he's also interested in woodblock prints and adapting them. And a friend of his, Arthur Wesley Dow from the Ipswich Art School, is trying to educate Americans to sort of free themselves from older European models of making nude studies, and let's look at old art. So there's a lot changing in America in art education, and Western Massachusetts and Boston are a hub. That's sort of the relatively high aspect. There's the popular aspect. There's great World's Fairs, as Alice is studying St. Louis. There's Philadelphia 1876. There's many smaller ones. And Japan is often one of the most popular exhibitors at these World's Fairs. The official buildings are industry and science and technology, but also the Japanese gardens, which are often feminized women wearing kimono. And then those World's Fairs are so popular that independent entrepreneurs, often Japanese, Kushibiki Yumindo comes to mind, but Americans as well. And then there's the Japanese village. So in Boston, Revere Beach, by 1902, we have the Japanese village and the Japanese gardens. I like they've recreated a Mount Fuji, which sort of goes with the Mount Fuji and the Hokusai print. So you could study Japan in prints and put them on your wall, and then you could go to some sort of a recreation of the place and drink tea and have Japanese cakes. That's usually what they called senbei, was Japanese cake, and Japanese food, and even dress up, maybe a la japonaise. And some of these Japanese villages sold antiques and curios and prints. And so Japanese culture is starting to, it's been called a high art, it's in museums, but it's something you're able to buy, or at least manifestations of it. And just one last local, people are building, they're putting collections together. So over in Springfield, one of the great collections of Meiji era is the George Washington Vincent Smith Museum. And then people are building gardens in just, I guess, east of here in Shrewsbury. Homer Gage builds an estate called Iristhorpe with a major Japanese garden. So Japanese culture is really permeating society across America, and Massachusetts maybe in particular.
Thank you both so much. Within this context, could you please provide some background on how Shin Hanga emerged and explain its defining subjects and themes? Starting with Alice again.
Okay, it's me again. We divided our labor in that I usually give kind of the broad background, and then Ken dives into the specifics. So before we even touch on Shin Hanga, I thought it would be helpful to kind of talk about what other kinds of prints, popular prints, were there, especially in Japan at that time. As someone who studies Meiji period art and visual culture, usually when I hear Meiji print, I think of this stuff. Not the lovely Shin Hanga that you're seeing on the exhibit, but there's a huge array of different kinds of Meiji prints. Usually, these are the ones that circulated in Japan, in that they dealt with kind of very common, every person, everyday kind of trends, a kind of tabloid-like news, gossip. There's a whole range, and that's what we're looking at. The one that you're seeing on the very right here, you can see that the caption, it literally says, "Woman cuts off lover's nose." I mean, that was kind of one of the reasons you have woodblock prints, so you can kind of circulate these salacious news tidbits. How true they were doesn't matter, because it's an amazingly interesting visual, and then there's a lot of text that kind of tells you this amazing thing that supposedly happened. And you can also take note of kind of the very brash colors. That's also part of the attractiveness of using woodblock print to kind of quickly disseminate the story, the fascinating stories of the day. And then another type of typical kind of, by the Meiji period, slightly kind of higher level of visual culture would be ones that really capture kind of major news items of the day. And during the Meiji period, there would be two international wars. The first one with China, the next one with Russia. So that's what you're seeing here, where this is one of these kind of grand triptychs that show a battle scene that was happening not on Japanese soil, but farther away, so the audience at home can really be part of that really amazing action that was happening, all that fighting. Again, artists probably use a lot of their imaginations to kind of really flesh out what was actually happening overseas, and kind of that excitement was what woodblock prints would be able to do, because in comparison, photography was not offering color at that time. And so that would be kind of the more typical ways that woodblock print would be kind of at least the larger volume Meiji period woodblock prints. Kind of there are many, many various purposes. It wasn't really only for artistic expression, and we'll go into that as we go into Shin Hanga, but the things that are usually not at all called Shin Hanga, the earlier stuff in the Meiji would be this, but I want to make sure that we at least show one very artistic example. And you know, artists like Kobayashi Kiyochika definitely was one of those people who were very interested in the artistic creative possibilities of woodblock print. You can't see it very well on this screen, but if you ever get to see one of this particular design in person, you know, he was really trying to push the limits of woodblock print in the sense that he wanted to see if it's possible to make that print look like it wasn't done through woodcut and printing, like really trying to mimic other kinds of visual genres. And so those were kind of, there were several artists of this time who was trying to kind of push that kind of artistic limitations. And I think those people, in a way, are more appropriately thought of as the progenitors to Shin Hanga.
Kawase Hasui, who we'll look at in a few minutes, really liked Kiyochika's landscapes and in many ways is pulling that forward. Again, if we'll go to the next slide, please, Fiona. Before we get to Shin Hanga proper, again, this sort of, things that happened before, and my job is to bring it here to Massachusetts. You have this guy. He's one of dozens of Japanese art dealers in America. Bunkyo Matsuki, who comes as a high school student to study in Salem. He's close to the Japanists in Boston. The Samuel F.B. Morse and Fenellosa work closely with him. And he has two Japanese art shops in Boston proper and one in Salem. And he has got art catalogs that he's selling to art collectors, high and low. The Freer Gallery is buying, or Charles Lang Freer for the Freer Gallery National Museum of Asian Art is buying from him. So he's selling everything, pottery, painting, including ukiyo-e and Meiji prints. And in his catalogs, this is for his shop on Boylston Street in Boston. And there is such an interest in so many Japanese arts coming into America. There's a fear that you're getting modern fakes being sold as old things, second edition woodblock prints that are cleaned up, or as Meiji ceramics, Satsuma in particular. And then, I don't know if you can read it, but in the text up here, in the middle slide, Bunkyo Matsuki says, I go to Japan every year, and I buy real things that Japanese themselves use, not these cheap exports that implicitly my rivals are selling. And one last aspect on Bunkyo Matsuki. So in addition to these kind of fine art catalogs, the lower right's image on the slide over there, this is catalog of Japanese artist materials for school supplies. In fact, starting in Massachusetts, the Massachusetts School Board in the 1890s, then across the country by the 1900s, Arthur Wesley Dow's textbooks use Japanese prints and Meiji-era books and materials to actually teach art education. So Bunkyo Matsuki is really leading sales of Japanese art for museums, for sort of middle-class collectors, and then to have every American school student copying, tracing, making his art making art based on them. Oh, and he does actually, before he died, he gave a lantern to the city of Boston and is there in the Commons. So kind of living a reminder of this important historic figure. All right, now your second question. You want to re-ask it?
Oh, yes. So the second question is, within this context, could you please provide some background on how Shin Hanga emerged and explain its defining subjects or themes?
So Shin Hanga which means new prints, and they're originally called Sosaku Shin Hanga, creative new prints, and it's important we keep that in mind. So as Alice was telling us, that most sort of wood blocks called brocade nishikie, like she showed us some what they called bloody prints. They were salacious, that's a great word for it, sexy, violent. Now I have to give a trigger warning to my students before I show them, because you're going to see things that are disturbing, perhaps. Shin Hanga is the opposite of that. In many ways, and this is maybe why the generation of my teachers couldn't take it seriously, it's kind of anodyne. It's sort of soft and soothing and a nostalgic, imagined, beautiful idea of Japan. The foreigners want this, and Japanese themselves want it. Japan is very industrial. So in Shin Hanga is emerging around 1915, 1920. There's been 40 years of modern Japan. Japan has caught up with the West. It's become an industrial nation. It's become a masculine and mechanical nation. I often call it the 3 M's, modern, militaristic, mechanical. And so Japanese culture has changed dramatically. People whose parents couldn't imagine foreign lands and wore kimono and only ate traditional food, their children live in a different world. They're wearing overalls to work in a factory, putting on a uniform to serve in the military, fighting in Korea or Taiwan. And so there's a desire both amongst the early publishers, who we'll talk about later, the artists and the audience in Japan and abroad, to see a different Japan, a sort of historic, quote-unquote, traditional, maybe we can gender it as a feminine Japan. So the 3 traditional genres of old ukiyo-e are kind of reimagined as landscape, but not so much landscape, they're places. Especially the city of Tokyo is radically changed and changing, and will change even more. So the desire to sort of see it at twilight. That sense of, the time of mystery. We don't want to see the railroad track. Well, some prints, as Alice showed us, are showing us the railroad tracks and the iron foundries and the new banks and all of that. And then there's the desire to sort of see the romanticized, nostalgic sense of the past. I love this print. This is one of the earliest ones by the artist Ito Shinsui, mainly famous for his beautiful women, but early landscape printings. The district of Ike no Hata, where I used to live, right between Tokyo University and Tokyo School of Fine Arts. And it was, even in modern Tokyo, until recent times, was famous for being a bit of a backwater. Traditional buildings, old restaurants, old customs, like a minstrel who would be strolling in the evening, going door to door, asking for a handout. So in many ways, this is a romanticized throwback to a former time. But interestingly, and to the point that Alice made about, this is a period in which Western culture and schools where you're learning oil painting and Western watercolor coming in, that there's a number of techniques here. This is a woodblock print that are perhaps derived from late 19th century European art. Because the artist Shinsui, although he didn't study at the Tokyo School of Fine Art, is well aware of all those new European styles that are coming into Japan. So this is kind of using, to some degree, Western visual culture in the Japanese revived woodblock print medium to kind of create a nostalgic view of Japan. The once and forever Japan as we hope it will be in our imagination and art. Next. So that's the genre of landscape, or really painting of places. Then there's the beautiful woman print, and very much in keeping with Alice's earlier slides. So these European teachers, Fontanesi and others, Capillari for sculpture, they're doing Western style art education. I teach in an art school. My students draw from nudes to this day. You start with plaster casts semester 1, nudes semester 2. So that's what they're doing over here on the right. And so this is the artist Hashiguchi Goyo, who's the kind of real first chapter of Shin Hanga, 1915, 16, 17, 18, paintings of beautiful women. And these are woodblock prints. Goyo makes a sketch based on a nude model who is in fact one of his many girlfriends. And he's very conscious of older ukiyo-e, even the poses, women at their toilette, making up, looking in mirrors, that we have the voyeuristic view of them as they're looking at themselves, making themselves beautiful. Even perhaps the sort of the textile pattern and some of the brushwork that Goyo uses are borrowed from Utamoto. But Goyo was collecting ukiyo-e prints. His uncle was a major collector. He was was a leader of the Edo Prince Appreciation Society. But Goyo here on the left is also studying oil painting. He's trained as an oil painter, and he's very aware of artists like Kuroda Seki, who'd been one of these artists who'd gone to Paris and studied in Paris, and the woman in front of the mirror. So what I'm trying to say is that these Shin Hanga prints are an interesting hybrid. Let's not say mishmash, but smooth synthesis between ukiyo-e sort of subject matter, some of the subjects adapted from European 19th century painting, and both the kind of surface patterning and some of the two-dimensional effects from ukiyo-e with clearly Western academic drawing in the round, really beautifully synthesized. And that's, again, a nostalgic, as Japanese young women are wearing Western clothes and high heels and permed hair, the desire to kind of reify women as curators of tradition. And then the third major subject of Shin Hanga is actor prints. And as Shin Hanga is developing early on, there's a desire to do make it like ukiyo-e. Make the prints relatively flat and two-dimensional, and emphasis on texture and only kind of minimal three-dimensional drawing. But very quickly, the audience, and primarily the audience for these are Japanese. Americans and Europeans don't really care about kabuki actors. They don't know who they are. They don't really know what the plays are. So these are primarily for a Japanese audience, but they're modernized. I think even the poses and the drawing here in the middle, this is from the 1920s, is much more three-dimensional, and there's a sense of presence. And it finally struck me, maybe after my first couple of articles or catalogs, that really what the artist here, Natori Shunsen, the specialist in actor portraits, he's looking at Hollywood movie stills like Rudolph Valentino. That sense of the presence, the poise, even the sort of almost lit by artificial light. So I think we can see that Shin Hanga is really a very complex art form that is kind of moderating all of these changes that are taking place from Japan in the Meiji period. Now we're into the Taisho period, the 19-teens and 20s.
Who comprised the primary audiences for Shin Hanga, both in Japan and abroad? Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
All right. So as Fiona pointed out, some of my research in the last 15 years has been on, so how did Shin Hanga get here? Why is it at the Worcester Art Museum or the MFA Boston or LA County Museum of Art or private collectors? Who was it made for? My teachers tended to put it down as tourist art, made for foreigners and not real Japanese art. And that's not really a fair critique on many levels, because the very first Shin Hanga exhibitions were held in Japan. This is the Shirokiya department store, which itself is a sort of hybrid building of Western Second Empire, the beef-eye windows, octagonal pavilion with Japanese tile roof, hipped and gabled roof. But Shirokiya department store where you would buy both conventional items and modern, up-to-date foreign, so-called high-collar clothes. Shirokiya had two exhibitions of Shin Hanga in 1921 and 22. So this is clearly aimed at a Japanese audience. But the early publisher, Watanabe and others, realized that there was, many foreigners were going to these, who lived in Japan or went there as tourists, were starting to buy these prints, and there was a big potential foreign market. And another thing to talk about this kind of transnational or intercultural dynamic in Shin Hanga is that there's certainly Japanese artists like Goyo or Shinsui, we just saw with his landscape, the minstrel Ike Nohata. They're trained in Western drawing and oil painting, as is Hasui, who trains both in Japanese traditional painting and in Western oil painting. And then we have Western artists like Charles Bartlett, who's gone to Japan on a holiday, gets trapped by World War I, can't go back to England, and then becomes interested in ukiyo-e prints and starts to work in early Shin Hanga. And again, so Western artists who are inspired by Japanese prints, Japanese artists who like Western art but are now exploring the print medium in their own traditions. And so with this diversity of artists and styles, that not surprisingly, there's an audience both at home and abroad. So let's now move to the next slide. And so after the early exhibitions of Shin Hanga in Tokyo, there's the big earthquake in 1923, September 1st, 11:59 a.m. Tokyo is largely destroyed. Yokohama audience for prints in Japan, foreign tourists in Japan, that's on hiatus. So the publisher Watanabe and an artist named Yoshida Hiroshi, who we'll get to meet later, have an exhibition of paintings and a few woodblock prints. I'll show you a slide later. It travels around the US. Then that was so popular that they decide that the US is going to be the major market for Shin Hanga. There's the population relative to Japan, there's the money, there's an interest in Japanese art, but new kinds of Japanese art. So the same publisher, Watanabe, together with the artist Yoshida Hiroshi, who we'll meet later, in 1926-27 organize a circuit exhibition of Shin Hanga to travel American museums. And it starts in Indianapolis, where this guy McLean, actually McLean had trained under Denman Ross at the MFA Boston, then became an independent curator. He's now director of the Indianapolis Museum, so he can do whatever he wants. Directors with a lot of power. And this show travels around 10 museums in the US. I'll talk more about it in a minute. And it actually comes here to Worcester in January, the late January 1927. So Worcester is on the ground floor of Shin Hanga, unfortunately not collecting, but display. And they're showing landscapes, beautiful women, and a few kabuki actor prints. And these prints were also for sale. So these are traveling exhibitions for sale. So they would, you could buy them right in the museum shop. And that was not uncommon back in the day for woodblock prints in particular. And prices were not that cheap for the 1920s. This is before the Depression, $13, $11, and so on. Next slide, please. That show was so popular that J. Arthur McLean, although he got fired as the director of the Indianapolis Museum, he landed on his feet as the curator at the Toledo Museum. And he, with his longtime assistant, Dorothy Blair, again with the Japanese artist turned printmaker Yoshida Hiroshi, they organize now a plan. Every 5 years, we'll have a new Shin Hanga exhibit, and it'll go to America. So in 1930, they have a big show. It does not come to Massachusetts, but it really goes coast to coast. As you can see the list here, and this is the show of about 150 to 170, maybe 200 prints, a lot, and it had a catalog. This is the first catalog of Shin Hanga, with over here on the bottom right, and they just talk about how many printings for each, how many different color blocks, the subject matter, and in fact this catalog was still in wide use till the 1990s. And my 1998 Shin Hanga New Prints in Modern Japan was the first catalog on Shin Hanga since this one in 1930. But this really brings Shin Hanga to the masses. And like those World's Fairs, then there's offshoots of these exhibitions. So next slide. And so we know a lot about who bought these prints, because the Toledo Museum had a lot of records. And so the records are how much prints sold for. There were 50. They had a stack of 50 as each one was sold. They counted down. When they sold all 50, you had to write to the publishers in Japan, and then they could send you the prints. There was also some tariff issues because Smoot-Hawley tariffs was passed, so they were all worried about tariffs and how to get these prints in without the customs inspectors knowing. That's a whole other story. We also know who bought the prints because the Toledo Museum had a ledger of who bought the prints. Some individuals, more women than men, Mrs. Harold Crane, and museum curators. Helen Gunselis was the curator of Asian art and prints at the Art Institute of Chicago. She bought a lot for her own institution. So Shin Hanga, through these circuit exhibitions of 27 and 1930, have really become mainstream.
So building on that, what were the commercial strategies for Shin Hanga publishers, and how did they shape the production, distribution, and reception of these prints? And starting with Alice.
Oh, okay. Well, sorry to bring it back in time again to the Meiji period, but I think it helps to kind of go back again to think about what was the place of woodblock prints as we get into the 20th century, when woodblock print had such a long history already. Like, was the 20th century even interested in woodblock print anymore? And the answer is yes and no. There were so many other competing, reprographic media in the 20th century. I mean, we've already seen an example, or have I already mentioned it maybe for the first time, photography, right? That was something new in the late 19th century, and going into the 20th century, photography will become a main competitor to printing, and also we have, after photography, we have lithography, chromolithography, you know, different ways of creating in many kind of in multiples the same design or the same image. And so that's what woodblock print was going up against as we head into the 20th century, where, you know, the clientele, the audience who were originally very interested in buying, collecting woodblock prints, now there's a whole lot of other, you know, ways to collect new and interesting, beautiful, creative prints of different kinds. And so that's why I wanted to show you at least one example of a typical studio photograph from the left, from an earlier time, 1870s. And then postcards. Those of you who go to the MFA to look at their collection there, you probably know they have a very famous collection of Japanese postcards. And so that also becomes a great competitor to woodblock prints, because artists, we haven't quite mentioned it, artists back in the Edo period and into the Meiji and beyond, they weren't simply designers of woodblock prints. They usually were painters as well. They now design for book illustrations, for postcards, for, you know, all posters, all sorts of things. So the active artists of the time they were everywhere, being, you know, able to make money in so many different ways, right? Making all these different creative designs. So, you know, that was kind of what was happening, where there were so many different competing ways of different formats and genres of, you know, for visual culture at the time.
It's stimulating collecting. I mean, they're competing in some ways, but there's different market share.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could collect photos, and Americans had albums, often with beautiful lacquer covers, and you could collect photos and put them in your album. If you had lesser means, or maybe you collected postcards, I think Leonard Lauder started as a kid collecting postcards. To your other point, Kiyokata makes paintings, he does illustrations to novels, he does some Shin Hanga, designs postcards. So artists are looking for multiple streams, and there's collectors collecting at multiple levels, which gets us then to publishers who realize, so Afina, if we could go to the next slide, assuming you were finished, Alice.
Oh, I don't, did I have a final point about, I mean, that's what made Shin Hanga so exciting, because it was actually a way to kind of go back in time and go back to the traditional way of doing woodblock printing, where you have the publisher was the person who basically put the team together. It was usually a he. I don't know if there's a she.
Yes, they're he. But it's handmade, I think, is your point.
Exactly.
The machines are producing these postcards and photos, or, you know, so this is
the
by
traditional way, where the designer is, you know, the publisher finds a designer, someone's going to, you know, obviously hand draw the design, but the cutter is hand cutting the block, the printer is doing the printing, and then, yeah, I mean, it's a very traditional way of doing things.
No machines involved.
And it goes up against these, you know, mechanical ways of reproducing.
Right, and they're very much sold that way. And again, this is coming, you know, in America, we've got arts and crafts movement at the time, so it's how does it fit into that? So since we were talking about publishers, so this guy is the Watanabe Shozaburo. He had worked in a shop selling ukiyo-e reprints of old 18th and 19th century prints, largely to foreigners, but he realizes, you know, there's a market for new art made in traditional ways that is showing us these somewhat nostalgic subjects, but imbuing them with a new energy. So Watanabe Shozaburo sets up his own shop in the early 1920s, about a block and a half away from the Imperial Hotel in Tokyo, where there's going to be lots of tourists. He even sets up his cousin over here with a company called Shobisha. And this is, as Alice said, this is where you would go to buy blocks. Now, they're not producing the prints in there. There's a studio somewhere else, but very much the sense that these are handmade with the old ukiyo-e quartet. The publisher is the head of house. He hires the artist supplies the design. It's turned over to a master carver whose name often appears on the print, and then a master printer. And so they're also for market share. Watanabe and others are doing reprints of old ukiyo-e. If you want that, you can buy the ukiyo-e reprint. And then if you're ready, you can buy the new thing, Shin Hanga. And even Shin Hanga is sort of marketed at big size or smaller size at a variety of budgets and sort of levels. So it's a very commercially oriented art, but I think in no way that mitigates its artistic value. I think we've got another slide. So in fact, Watanabe's Shin Hanga prints for those 1927 and 1930 exhibitions were so popular that other printers, Kawaguchi, Sakai, this is a team. Kawaguchi was an importer-exporter. Sakai is a print guy, so they get together, like the business side and the production side, and they have exhibitions across America and Europe. And these are not, by the time we're in the 30s, there's the Depression. Macy's is selling Shin Hanga prints from $1.94 to $5.74. Every penny counted. Other publishers, Doi, are working, and they're having exhibitions in America, not so much at big museums, but at libraries. This is an advertisement for the Student Union at the University of Wisconsin is having a Christmas print sale. Students complete their exams, want to buy some prints, give them to family for wow. holiday gifts. What are the venues? Furniture stores. You're selling beds and desks and dressers, and you need prints on the wall. Framed prints Shin Hanga are being sold. Or at a famous Goodspeed bookshop, which is a Boston institution, they're selling Shin Hanga prints. So they're really disseminating widely in America in the 30s through a variety of publishers who are all jumping into this medium and this specific aesthetic type.
So in that vein, what coordination efforts and institutional networks in the US facilitated Shin Hanga's promotion, particularly in New England? And I believe we're starting with...
So what is part of making Shin Hanga and other art forms, especially commercially reproducible art forms that are sort of going from mass production to something like fine art, are institutions that we now take for granted, like museums. Museums really aren't that old an institution, and there weren't that many in the 19th century. I mean, they're pretty much in America a turn of the century to early 20th century phenomenon, and then museum curators meeting professionally and exchanging, having meetings. So just with Shin Hanga, I talked about this early circuit exhibition. This is 1924. So before the big 1927 and 30 show, that there was an exhibition, and this is an important transition because after the Tokyo earthquake, this guy, Yoshida Hiroshi, and his wife, Fujio, are coming to America to sell Japanese paintings. Watercolor and some oils, but mainly traditional sumie, ink paintings. And this is to raise money for artists who have been devastated by the earthquake. They've lost their house, their studio, they've lost all their patronage. Nobody's buying their art. So Yoshida Hiroshi comes around America selling paintings, and his friend, the publisher Watanabe, says, why don't you take a few woodblock prints? And as Yoshida is going around to all these museums where his exhibition is happening, he notices something interesting. The newspaper critics write about the paintings as beautiful, but nobody buys them. And the whole point was to sell art to raise money for these artists hurt by the earthquake. However, the few woodblock prints are acquired. So this is the bulletin on the right of the Cleveland Museum for 1924, and it lists acquisitions by gift somebody gave it or what they acquired and spent money on. And Yoshida Hiroshi's own paintings were gifts of the artist. The museum didn't pay for them. I don't even know if they wanted them, but they took them. However, the museum acquired by purchase 2 Shin Hanga woodblock prints by Kawase Hasui. So Yoshida saw the writing on the wall. Nobody wants my old paintings anymore, too Meiji-esque, but they want these woodblock prints. He goes back to Japan and creates a woodblock print studio and starts to create woodblock prints, some of which are on display here and we'll see later. And then, so as Fiona asked, what are the institutions? So just museums in number. Every American city has a museum by the 19-teens. And then there's real museum institutions. So the Association of Museum Directors still functions. So when Yoshida Hiroshi sails from Yokohama to San Francisco in 1923, 3 months after the Tokyo earthquake, the first thing he does is go to the San Francisco Museum of Art, meet with J. Nilsson Lorvik, the director, and say, I want to travel around America having a sale of paintings and a few woodblock prints. Can you help set it up? And Lorvik writes letters to museum directors across the country. So this, institutions, these are networks that have been formed that Yoshida plays. And then in Japan, similar networks, the government is trying to promote Japanese culture, especially after 1934 and the annexation of Manchuria. So the Japanese government, through the Board of Tourist Industries, writes the Japanese Tourist Library, books on Japanese art forms, books in English, on gardens and dolls and flower arrangement, meant to put the best cultural picture. This is soft political propaganda. Don't think of Japan as invading Manchuria and China. Think of Japan as these beautiful traditional arts. And in the book on woodblock prints, what do they show as the frontispiece? Not ukiyo-e, not hokusai, not hiroshige, Shin Hanga. Watanabe had a close relationship with the government. So institutions both in America and in Japan, and I think we have one more slide. So other institutions, so I told you about the 1924 painting, post-earthquake painting and prints. Circuit might have come to Worcester. We're not sure if that was their 1924 exhibition. 27, 30, and then in 1936, there's another Shin Hanga traveling circuit exhibition, and this one is organized by the College Art Association, which to this day, I think Alice and I are all members of CAA, is the leading. So CAA organized the College Art Association, this 1936 traveling show. It's not terribly successful, but it does go over to your neighbor Springfield at the George Washington Vincent Smith Museum. So here is Massachusetts again showing up in the early days of Shin Hanga. So these institutions and networks are really crucial to a new mass art like Shin Hanga. One couldn't exist without the other. The institutions needed prints and things to circulate. The prints needed venues to be seen and sold.
Thank you. And Alice, I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how this affected the creation of Japanese art museum collections.
Right. In case you're wondering what's been happening with kind of formations of Japanese art collections, both in Japan and now here in the US, I just want to make sure that I kind of add a little bit of that background information. Woodblock prints, Shin Hanga, they were not going to be part of the national collection at this moment in time, in late 19th century into the 20th century. The first set of imperial museums, they're now called the national museums in Japan, were being formed in this time, late 19th century, just like the museums are being formed here in the US. But artworks like woodblock prints historically were never considered fine art or very precious rare art. They were not going to be part of the very first kind of collection of the national collection of art. And so that's why they continue to be kind of collected, enjoyed at the personal level. And you will not, nowadays they have entered the national collection, but not immediately. And so what were the museums back then more interested in Japan? You would have much older artworks, like, again, the ink painting on paper, on silk, the scrolls, much older artworks from the earlier time periods, definitely religious art like Buddhist artwork. So even when you go today to the national museums, those are kind of the main parts of the collections that you'll get to enjoy, such as the kind of treasures from the Horyuji Buddhist temple. But at the same time, what was happening here in, let's say, for example, the MFA collection here of the Japanese art, what was fascinating is these were private collectors like Fenollosa, like Bigelow, like Edward Morris, who who kind of on personal instinct picked the stuff that they were drawn to. And they were doing both. They were kind of gobbling up the old art from Japan, but at the same time, they were also interested in supporting living artists. So I wanted to show at least one example of a painting from an artist of their time who they got to know personally. And so that's how we have such an interesting collection of Japanese art here in the Boston area, in that we're kind of living with their taste. You know, they were visiting Japan, they saw what they saw, people brought them things, and, you know, people like, who I just mentioned, Fenellosa Bigelow, but, you know, Isabella Stewart Gardner, you know, farther away, Charles Freer, they kind of used their own taste and instinct working with some of, you know, the dealers at the time. And so that's why we see a difference. The American collections of Japanese art, even though they were being formed also at the same time as the national collections, they were quite different, because those were really national level institutional collections versus kind of a more personal taste that was forming them. And that's where Shin Hanga kind of falls in place for the American audience, because there were so many people who enjoyed them, who collected them, who bought them.
I think that's a good point, that the
Right?
national museums or imperial museums are representing the nation. My next lecture is at the Japanese embassy next week, and they needed to vet my slides beforehand because it's representing Japan. The Worcester Art Museum didn't vet my slide, well, a little bit, Fiona, but other things. But yes, that's the difference. That's a key difference.
I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we
Makes,
can
in
go
some
on.
ways, it makes our collections a little more idiosyncratic,
I
but
think so.
creative. Okay, so let's get back to Boston, since I've talked a lot about this guy, Yoshida Hiroshi, and his wife, who was actually his adoptive sister turned wife. They got married. So he had come in the 1890s, back in the Meiji period, that first sort of interest in American Japanism, and he had traveled in Detroit, where he sold a painting to Charles Lang Freer. We'll see that. Then he came to Boston, had an exhibition. The second exhibition that Fenellosa curated at MFA was a Yoshida Hiroshi show. And in fact, the MFA Boston collected watercolors. The ones on the right, they tend to be sort of these exoticizing scenes of Japan, traditional Japan. And Yoshida Hiroshi's, at that time, sister was also very much the living Madame Butterfly. So there's a degree of kind of oriental exoticism that's part of this. Next slide. Interestingly, these early paintings, so as we talked about, Yoshida gave up trying to sell paintings to America by the 20s, but he did take some of his earlier paintings. This is a famous one on the left that was sold to Charles Lang Freer in Detroit for $1,234, well, actually for $500, amongst a whole group that Yoshida sold for over $1,000. That was all big money in 1899. And then Yoshida, later, when he realized that these old paintings wouldn't sell anymore by the 1920s, he took these old designs and he turned them into Shin Hanga prints, updating them, changing them, now making them affordable to the masses. I think we've got one more. And so Fiona asked me, how did Massachusetts in particular really play a role in addition to what we've seen so far? So for Yoshida Hiroshi in particular, oh, and by the way, Alice talked about that the national museums and exhibitions didn't show prints until 1927, when this guy, Yoshida Hiroshi, had enough power that he forced the National Salon Teiten, or Bunten, to show craft and woodblock prints. But it was his impetus, and that's 1927. At any rate, so Hiroshi comes to Massachusetts. He makes art here. He's part of art colonies out in the Berkshires. Here's a painting of Sunset at Tyringham. He does paintings down in Provincetown. So he's making art in Boston. He's certainly making money. He's selling his painting and later prints here, as we saw. And he's also making connections, because I introduced you to the publisher Watanabe, who published some of Yoshida Hiroshi's early prints, and then Shobisha was the competitor to Watanabe. And in fact, I mean, it's deep in the weeds, but in 1891, when Hiroshi Yoshida is in Boston, he meets that guy Matsuki Bunkyo that we saw before, and in fact, they become friends, and then Matsuki Bunkyo's younger brother marries one of Yoshida's sisters. So, I mean, they get to build family connections, and presumably it's through these family connections that when Yoshida goes back to Japan, he actually meets Shozaburo, the publisher, and starts making prints with him. So Boston and Massachusetts become a real, for this guy, the really like crucible for his life and his art.
And then these two are beautiful donations to the MFA Boston, so they did start collecting them eventually. Could you discuss that a little bit more?
I brought these two in just for a quick mention because they're just so lovely to look at, and also just the idea that it's very different when you're collecting living artists or art that's being produced in your very own time, and so it was important to kind of add when the works were created and when they entered the collection at the MFA, for you to see that there's usually a little bit of a lag. You know, the person collects it, they enjoy it, and then at some point later in their life, they themselves or the family donates it to a museum. And I just want to kind of put in context, again, if you know a bit about the MFA, they're very well known for the Spalding collection. That was more than 6,000 prints that entered the MFA collection, but in the 1920s. So that was much too early for any significant, Shin Hanga to have been produced by that point. So you'll note that the Spalding collection was really just kind of your classic ukiyo-e from the 18th and 19th century. And so that's why the Shin Hanga would kind of come in small spurts much later on, even though they were created in the 19s and the 1920s and 30s. People, my conjecture is they bought them, they enjoyed it for a while, and then at some point they will gift it to the museum, and that's why there are actually quite a number of Shin Hanga works in that collection because of kind of different.
So here at Worcester, you had the 1927 January show, but alas, nothing was collected from it. Because, it's one thing to show it and maybe make a percentage on the sale, but it's another thing to collect it. It takes a generation for it to end up in the will, and now it's a little historic.
And I think usually it takes that kind of time for people to realize the value of a work, right? Very few of us have enough confidence and eye to say right away, this is a very hot, artist, and that's put in the big money right now and buy it and put it in the collection.
Right. We use the term, it stands the test of time. I mean, that's not just folk wisdom, that's the philosopher David Hume responding to Immanuel Kant on, is aesthetic subjective or objective? And Hume says, no, it's objective if it stands the test of time. Now, it might only be one generation, but still, that's something.
So I just want to be conscious of time, but to kind of cinch together all of these themes, I just wanted to ask your thoughts on the future of Japanese printmaking in New England and how Sosaku Hanga had a presence post-World War II. And so I think, can you have,
So I'll start. So since we're kind of focusing on the Yoshida family and what happens next, well, Hiroshi dies in 1950, and then his children, in fact, starting with his elder son Toshi, follows in his footsteps, almost literally, travel to America, make friends with Americans. This is where the economy is booming, collectors, museums. So in 1953, which is right when the occupation ends and Japanese can get passports again and travel abroad without needing American permission from MacArthur. So he travels around the US from 1953 to 54, showing his father's art. That was famous and well known, but also his younger, the son's art, both Shin Hanga style and this new Sosaku Hanga creative prints. And in fact, there's an exhibition that comes here to Worcester in 1954, and it had a catalog. Now it's new art and old art, older Shin Hanga, new Shin Hanga, and new Sosaku Hanga creative prints all together. In this case, all connected by the Yoshida family. I think we have one more. And so, in fact, this is the document that Fiona found for me from the curator here to the director after this 1954 lecture by Toshi, printmaking display, demonstration, and sale. And in this case, your institution got on it and bought 3 prints in 1953. Here they are, of this new style of later post-war Shin Hanga / Sosaku Hanga. So it does evolve and is continuing to evolve. There's young artists, many of them foreigners, going to Japan, studying the Yoshida, other studios, making art that either kind of preserves these older styles or in many ways adapts it in creative ways. So Shin Hanga is still evolving in some ways. Not as dynamic as it was, but not dead either.
And then we have Ayomi's work.
Yeah, I think it's nice to end on this image. This is, I guess, the 3rd generation Yoshida, Yoshida Ayomi, who continues the printmaking and is very much an international artist. And so this is kind of some of her works, installations. You can see that very much connected to the US still, major venues. And for me, as someone who likes to kind of look on furniture kind of websites, I'm sure some of you know Room and Board. Her work is actually available if you want to buy limited edition prints by Ayomi through Room and Board. And I think that kind of connects nicely to what Ken was saying earlier about Macy's and furniture stores selling print art, because you know, in a way, it's nice decoration for your home, but at the same time, it's very good work.
I saw Ayomi when she first worked with the Room and Board giving a lecture in Manhattan down in Soho, and she was a little apologetic, and I said, no, Ayomi, your grandfather organized exhibitions at furniture stores and was well aware that these prints were going to go on the wall in somebody's bedroom. Don't apologize. That's been part of the history from the beginning.
It's such an interesting continuum. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this subject. I do think we have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has any, we can start down here.
The World's Fair is extremely interesting. I think of the 94, which was Meet Me in St. Louis, a celebration as like a new kind of internationalism. But I know that in that exhibit, there was an exhibit of Filipinos as kind of subhuman and in need of civilization. And of course, the laws against Chinese immigrants, the one specifically racial ban on immigration, was against the Chinese in the same period. So I wonder if you could speak more about intra-Asian relations and how they affect the East-West dynamic. That's the main focus of your talk and your work.
Yeah, thank you for asking. I mean, World's Fairs, I mean, the topic is so rich. There's so much happening. 1904 in St. Louis, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition was definitely it's a major one. I mean, it came after the 1893 Chicago, but the fact that one of the biggest highlights of 1904 was the kind of the Filipino villages, where more than 1,000 Filipinos were brought over in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War. They had become part of American territory. It was one of the, I would say, uglier parts of World's Fair history. Whether there was kind of awareness among the different Asian cultures and ethnicities, I've yet to see actual.
I think, was it St. Louis that, so as I understand it, or maybe misunderstand it, in response to this sort of Western imperialism, we're showing our colonial, the French would show their Congo village, Belgians, that at one of the World's Fairs, maybe St. Louis, Japan had its Ainu village.
It was there too, yes, at this one.
Americans had the Igorot village, the Filipinos, the Japanese had the Ainu.
So they were all part of the so-called anthropological display. So the Japanese Ainu were part of that, the Filipinos, they're indigenous peoples from every other part of the world, plus American indigenous tribes were also there. So how aware were the kind of the government of Japan of the other things that were happening? They were aware. They knew the Ainu were there. The Ainu exhibit actually was not part of the Imperial Japanese organization. It was organized by the anthropology department on the American side. I think the struggle at that time was always the need to kind of define themselves as better than, kind of separate themselves. Even like Japan against China, there was a lot of friendly and not so friendly competition on the fairgrounds to kind of make themselves different and more civilized, however you want to define it. So Japan was in the fine arts pavilion, but China didn't get to go in there. And so those are the kind of little things and some big things to kind of define who was higher on that hierarchy of civilization. And so, unfortunately, I haven't come across much in terms of kind of solidarity among the different ethnic groups. A lot of the time was just kind of stiff competition because you're trying to sell your goods. You're on there, on the fairgrounds, trying to sell your pottery, your lacquerware, your silk, and tea was another big commodity. It was competition among the Japanese, India, so there.
And amongst tea sellers in Japan,
Yes.
you have the Formosan tea in Taiwan as a colony. Then you have the Shizuoka Green Tea Association. They have their tea house and garden.
Yeah, there was a lot happening. But definitely awareness, but not so much solidarity, unfortunately. But that was the way of the World's Fairs. You were there to compete. Yeah.
Any others? Matthias.
I have a question about, on the one hand, about the the appreciation for Japanese culture, and on the other hand, quite extreme racism in America. And I just recently read a book by Edna, what is her name? Edna Ferber, So Big, and it talks about somebody being successful in society, and everybody who was successful at the beginning of the 20th century, East Coast, had to have, so let's say New York and Boston, had to have a Japanese servant who was called a Jap. And I was really shocked when I was reading this. So what can you say about this dichotomy between the appreciation of the culture and then this very brutal racism, actually?
Yeah, my students often, they're surprised when I teach this. What, in this era of, pretty much common everyday racism and this hierarchy, whether it's World's Fairs or on the street, where this appreciation for Japan, I say this, it's often, it's the culture, but the actual people.
Yeah.
You'd want the Japanese art in your living room, you wouldn't want the person unless they're your servant. And this was an era where they were common to have Japanese servants. You'd want a Japanese garden, but it's the Japanese boy gardener who's your chauffeur and cook and is part of it. So that's the other side of it. To be sure.
The only exception is if you're royalty. Let's say if you are Prince whoever from Japan, then obviously you're welcomed in polite society and you're considered somewhat equal.
Yeah, Bunkyo Matsuki, who I showed, did marry had a Caucasian wife, and I don't know if they had children, but if they would have, it would have been biracial children. So within this pretty brutal social dynamic, there is some, beginnings of mixing and accepting. But yes, I find all the students right. You want the art, you just didn't want the person.
I think the difference is the majority of East Asians who were already here in America were laborers. So that was the understanding that Asians equal laboring class. There were so few examples of people who were from the elite classes that the common American understanding in the 19th and early 20th century was Asians mean people who do hard labor and they're not very important people. And so that's where the kind of hardened racism really kept building because it was so rare to have somebody who was so high up in the social hierarchy to interact with.
Clearly there's examples. So Yoshida is somebody who undoubtedly experienced racist insults on the street, in hotels and restaurants, everywhere, no question about it. But somehow, managed to have this lifelong onto his children and grandchildren. There's other artists, Kawabata Rushi, a Japanese painter, came to America, worked as a houseboy, went to the MFA Boston, saw the Japanese art, went back to Japan, became an ultra-nationalist, anti-American to the end of his days. So, there's that reaction too.
I think we have time for one more question. Sure, in the back.
Specifically about one of the photos you showed at the beginning where you had an example of Mount Fuji. Mount Fuji is a print, and then it almost looked like a theme park attraction or something,
Yes.
like one of the Japanese gardens. So I was just, But then you also said in Shrewsbury there was somebody who had the largest Japanese garden. And just from like an Orientalist sort of exotic perspective, how much of this was theme park attraction type interest versus like sincere interest in
Well, yeah, it's a very good question.
Yeah, so just like your personal intuition for sort of like how were they looking at the high, low culture aspects of this?
But I think, you know, obviously trying to judge what's sincere. I mean, people could collect the art and harbor, you know, when push came to shove, let's not let Japanese immigrate and become citizens. I love Japanese art, but citizenship, no way. I'm sure that was a lot of people, if not the majority. But one could argue, did these things like gardens and theme parky environments, I've argued as a garden historian, they did not succeed in stopping the California Alien Land Act. The Japanese couldn't buy land. But they didn't stop World War II from happening, and they didn't stop atomic bombs, but maybe they led to post-war rebuilding of friendship a little more quickly, a little more easily. I think we have to look at kind of nuanced relationships. What do you think,
I mean,
Alice?
there was a lot of tea house and garden diplomacy, right? I mean, before World War II and after World War II, where, you know, major cities and maybe some not so major always got some kind of gift of a Japanese tea house or a Japanese tea garden, and that's a way of building friendships. I mean, you can be cynical and say it's a quick, you know, way to kind of build something, but I think there is lasting.
During the Cold War, Eisenhower starts sister city, citizen-to-citizen diplomacy, and the Germans don't do very much. You know, maybe a sculpture of a bear from Berlin in Los Angeles in the park next to where I live, but the Japanese really built a tea house, a garden in almost every major city, and even in the pre-war, in the 30s, there's one in Providence, Roger Williams Park, that is a Japanese government 30s attempt at this diplomacy.
And a lot of it is leftover gardens and tea houses from the World's Fairs. So, I mean, that is a form of soft power. And again, you can be cynical and say it was an easy way to kind of easy win. But at the same time, I think it did make a difference. I mean, it didn't take away all racism, but it helped to kind of continue to try to bridge the U.S. and Japan.
And it's still ongoing.
Yeah, and it still goes on.
Yeah.
Well, on the topic of this sort of high-low divide, such as like furniture stores and seeing it as wall decorations, I mean, so would a print by Hiroshige or a print by later like Kawase Hasui or somebody, would that have been viewed with sort of the same weight as a print from like Jacques Louis David or like a Titian, like Old Master print or something, or was it seen as sort of like just an exotic, like inferior, like side culture?
Well, it's certainly not seen as an old master. Maybe a Hiroshige first edition. I often think economically, I've been accused of being a Marxist. I am not. Maybe a little Marxy here and there. But yes, economically, until it hits like the $10,000, there's just a plain economic. You know, it has to hit a certain price point to be, you know, valuable. Culture, a certain degree of cultural value is dependent on economic value, let's say. But it's always aware that these are mass-produced. They're not old masters. They're not one of a kind. That's fundamental.
Although it's handmade.
So it's somewhere in between. It's not machine-made, but it's handmade.
Yes.
So it's an art affordable more or less to everybody. Although recently Shin Hanga prices have hit the roof. $130,000 last year in New York. For something that dealers don't like it when I show a print that this sold for $1.37 at Macy's in 1932. Dealers don't want to keep that. They don't keep that secret, Ken. Don't let that out.
All right, well, I think that's the time we have. So thank you all so much for coming. And if you haven't already seen the exhibition across Shin Hanga, Reflections of a Changing Japan, it's on view until June 29th of this year. So I would definitely encourage you all to go see it if you can. Thank you so much. Thank you.